Look directly at the Strait of Hormuz. It is a narrow, vulnerable stretch of water off the southern edge of Iran, and right now it is the absolute choke point of the global economy. Surprised? Before the bombs started dropping, this channel handled a staggering 20% of the planet's daily oil supply, alongside a massive footprint of natural gas. Today, it is a paralyzed combat zone. We are witnessing the geopolitical equivalent of a heart attack, and the economic shockwaves are detonating directly at the American gas pump. Size. As the conflict in Iran dramatically escalates, the Trump administration is desperately scrambling for a domestic financial tourniquet to stop fuel prices from crippling their midterm election hopes. But here is the cold, unforgiving reality of global energy markets. Unless the missiles stop flying and the tankers start moving, the Oval Office is practically out of ammunition. You cannot simply legislate away a global supply shock of this magnitude. The White House is floating every desperate fix in the playbook, from raiding the national emergency reserves to banning American energy exports. But experts are issuing a dire warning. If this blockade drags out, we aren't just looking at expensive gas. We are staring down the barrel of a 135 per barrel nightmare that could trigger a full-blown recession. Before we break down the frantic closed-door meetings, the failing $20 billion Maritime bailout, and exactly why the U.S. drilling industry is refusing to come to the rescue, you need to understand what is actually happening on the water. Make sure to hit that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments. Do you think the administration has a secret lever to pull, or are we heading for an economic crash? Let's dive into the data. Based on incisive new reporting by Brad Plumer, the Trump administration is currently locked in a desperate hunt for economic shock absorbers. As the military offensive in Iran drives global crude into the stratosphere and domestic gasoline prices sharply upward, the White House is frantically trying to insulate the American voter from the financial blowback. Yet history is an unforgiving teacher. Every commander-in-chief since the 1970s has crashed into the exact same wall. Once the global oil market panics, shielding the domestic consumer is nearly impossible. Lawmakers are currently tossing every conceivable bandage at the problem, draining strategic stockpiles, placing embargoes on American fuel exports, and even floating a federal gas tax holiday. But without a total cessation of hostilities in Iran, a silver bullet simply does not exist. Bob McNally, who navigated these exact waters as an energy advisor to George W. Bush and now heads the Rapidan Energy Group, laid it out plainly. Veterans of energy crises know there are zero painless fixes here. As long as kinetic warfare is choking off global supply lines, the Oval Office lacks any genuinely effective mechanism to force prices down. Here is the raw anatomy of the crisis. Oil is skyrocketing because the theater of war has completely gridlocked the Strait of Hormuz. This vital maritime artery traditionally processes roughly a fifth of the world's crude and a massive share of its natural gas. Because petroleum is a globally integrated commodity, that regional paralysis has instantly mutated into surging costs for American gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel. Market analysts are unified on this point. Until commercial shipping safely resumes, either through a peace deal or the total neutralization of the Iranian threat, meaningful price relief is a fantasy. And the longer the guns fire, the higher the ceiling goes. Rory Johnston, the architect behind Commodity Context, categorizes this as the single most severe supply disruption in the history of the oil market. He notes that until the strait is unblocked, any policy moves out of Washington are merely rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. The numbers are brutal. International crude spiked by a third right out of the gate, flirting with the 100 a barrel threshold for most of Monday. It only cooled slightly after President Trump appeared on CBS News, asserting that the military operation was pretty much totally finished. Domestically, gasoline has spiked 17%, resting at a national average of $3.50 a gallon, a peak we haven't seen since 2024. Behind the scenes, the president is huddling with his inner circle, weighing dramatic interventions like waiving federal fuel taxes or locking down U.S. exports. Publicly, however, the administration is aggressively downplaying the crisis. They are selling the narrative that this financial pain is a brief hiccup, promising a rapid conclusion to the war. On Monday, Trump declared his forces were permanently extinguishing the Iranian threat, guaranteeing that American families would reap the rewards of cheaper energy as a result. He issued a stark ultimatum, warning that any further Iranian interference in the strait would be met with an unprecedented level of retaliation, insisting his military is decisively winning and operating well ahead of schedule. White House spokeswoman Taylor Rogers reinforced this confident posture, stating that the president's energy task force had a robust stabilization strategy fully baked before Operation Epic Fury even launched, and that they are actively vetting all viable options. The most immediate weapon at their disposal is the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the nation's subterranean emergency crude stockpile. While allied nations hold similar reserves, the G7 coalition announced Monday they are currently refusing to coordinate a massive, synchronized release. Analyst Rory Johnston admits that while tapping the reserves won't fully compensate for a blocked Hormuz, it remains the most impactful physical lever the West can pull. The political optics here are highly complex. Trump previously hammered the Biden administration for bleeding the reserve following the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, and he has so far resisted opening the taps himself. The U.S. reserve holds roughly 415 million barrels, capped at a daily extraction rate of 4.4 million barrels. Compare that to the 20 million barrels per day that flowed through Hormuz prior to the conflict, and you see the mathematical deficit. Even if Trump pulls the trigger, the relief is marginal. When the previous administration flooded the market with 1 million barrels a day for half a year in 2022, it merely softened the blow. Crude stubbornly remained above $100 a barrel for months. Alternative strategies are politically radioactive. Last week, Arizona Democratic Senator Mark Kelly pitched freezing the 18.4-cent federal gas tax. However, that maneuver requires congressional approval and would instantly gut the Highway Trust Fund. A far more aggressive tactic would involve slamming the door on American oil exports. Following the domestic fracking explosion, Congress eliminated a decades-old export ban in 2015. Today, the U.S. pushes out over 10 million barrels a day. The theoretical logic is that trapping that crude stateside would flood the domestic market and temporarily crush prices. The reality? It would totally scramble domestic refinery logistics, inflict massive economic damage on allied trade partners in Europe and Latin America, and violently upend the American oil sector. Kevin Book of Clearview Energy Partners bluntly categorizes it as a disastrous policy tool, guaranteed to inflict long-term damage. Yet, as he notes, desperate politicians facing a crisis rarely possess the discipline to simply let the free market resolve it. Then there is the geopolitical wild card, selectively lifting sanctions on Russian oil. Millions of barrels of Russian crude are currently rotting in idle tankers. In a highly controversial move last week, the U.S. Treasury quietly granted Indian refineries a temporary pass to purchase more of that blacklisted Russian supply. Other proposals, like loosening EPA mandates to allow for cheaper summer fuel blends, would barely register on the national average. Jason Bordoff, who leads Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy, acknowledges that Washington is running through its standard crisis playbook, but he stresses a grim reality. If the Strait of Hormuz is functionally closed, none of these standard tricks will make a meaningful dent. The reality on the water is incredibly grim. Commercial transit through the strait has virtually flatlined. With approximately 10 vessels already taking fire, major shipping conglomerates are outright refusing to navigate the kill zone. In a desperate bid to keep the lanes open, the Trump administration rolled out a $20 billion maritime insurance subsidy last week. Industry insiders say it's a drop in the bucket. A subsidy doesn't stop an Iranian suicide drone. The White House has also teased deploying U.S. naval escorts for commercial fleets, but that logistical mountain takes significant time to scale. Meanwhile, regional allies like the UAE and Saudi Arabia are scrambling to reroute a few million daily barrels south toward the Red Sea via existing pipeline infrastructure. It is a drop in the ocean compared to the missing Hormuz volume. The secondary effects are already crystallizing. Gulf nations will soon be forced to cap their own wells if they cannot load outbound tankers. Kuwait and Iraq are already slashing their output, setting the stage for long-term global deficits. Energy experts warn that even if the strait is magically cleared tomorrow, physically rebooting those dormant wells is a process measured in weeks, if not months. If this blockade stretches out, the forecasting is apocalyptic. Rapidan Energy projects that a prolonged closure could catapult crude to a staggering $135 a barrel. So, will the mighty American drilling industry ride to the rescue? Last year, domestic producers shattered records, pumping out 13.6 million barrels a day, but don't expect a sudden surge in Texas. Bob McNally points out a deeply ingrained industry hesitation. Energy executives know the historical cycle. Sudden war-driven oil spikes routinely trigger global recessions, which inevitably lead to a catastrophic collapse in oil demand. The absolute last thing an oil CEO wants to do right now is invest in massive, multi-million-dollar drilling rigs, only to have the market completely bottom out by the time the crude actually hits the surface. The ultimate long-term solution is demand destruction, weaning the American economy off crude entirely. Today's economy is undeniably more insulated from oil shocks than the gas line era of the 1970s, largely due to major leaps in industrial efficiency and vehicle mileage. However, the current administration has systematically dismantled federal support for electric vehicles and slashed fuel economy mandates. Reversing course now wouldn't yield results for years. As Jason Bordoff pointedly observes, the fatal flaw in American energy policy is political amnesia. The second a price crisis subsides, Washington's focus instantly evaporates, ensuring we are never fundamentally prepared for the next time the global market catches fire. The White House is caught in a brutal, unforgiving trap of its own making. Operation Epic Fury may be achieving its kinetic military objectives, but the collateral damage is ripping straight through the foundation of the American economy. We are witnessing the absolute limits of presidential power. You can order a decapitation strike on a foreign adversary, but you cannot command a barrel of crude oil to be cheap. The administration is currently throwing everything at the wall, raiding strategic reserves, floating massive insurance bailouts for frightened shipping companies, and quietly easing the leash on Russian oil exports. But the math simply does not add up. The 20 million barrels of daily crude trapped behind the Strait of Hormuz cannot be magically replaced by Washington policy memos. The stakes for the midterm elections are astronomical. We are looking at a terrifying economic fork in the road. In one scenario, the administration manages to rapidly pacify the Gulf, the tankers resume their routes, and the GOP gets to claim a massive foreign policy victory without triggering a domestic financial meltdown. But if this blockade holds, and Rapidan Energy's 135 a barrel nightmare becomes a reality, the ripple effects will be devastating. We are talking about crippling inflation, a paralyzed logistics sector, and a highly probable war-induced recession striking right as voters head to the ballot box. Furthermore, the utter refusal of the American drilling industry to drastically increase production exposes a massive vulnerability in the energy dominance narrative. The crisis in Iran has proven that as long as the United States relies heavily on global crude, our domestic economy will always remain at the mercy of the world's most volatile choke points. So, where do we go from here? Can the administration end this war before the American consumer breaks, or are we locked into a massive, unavoidable economic crisis? Drop your most brutally honest predictions in the comments below. If you want the unvarnished truth about the intersection of global war and your wallet, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and share this video.